Bears rarely attack humans, but when they do, their ferocity leaves no one untouched. Once their instincts are triggered, they strike without hesitation, regardless of how defenseless their target may be. Such was the case in a tragic incident at a kindergarten, where a Russian grizzly bear's rampage led to a devastating loss. Join us as we recount the events of this heartbreaking attack. On July 17, 2024, the sun hung low over the edge of the Ural Mountains, casting golden light over the sleepy village of Baranovka. Tucked into the remote Russian wilderness, the town was home to just over 100 souls. Most relied on subsistence farming and seasonal forestry for their livelihoods. That summer, an unusually warm spell had driven game deep into the forests, leaving the region's apex predators desperate and bold. The villagers had heard whispers of bears wandering dangerously close, but such tales were common in the countryside and usually carried little weight. The Russian grizzly bear that came down from the mountains that day was not just bold, but starving. Its ribs pushed visibly against its coarse fur, and its massive paws dragged heavily in the dry earth. Driven by a gnawing emptiness, the bear wandered past the outskirts of Baranovka, sniffing for anything edible. It stumbled upon trash piles and overturned crates, and even pawed at a locked shed in search of food. Nothing satisfied its hunger. Then it heard the sound of laughter, high, bright, and piercing in the still air. The kindergarten stood on the village's eastern edge, a cheerful building painted in fading pastels. A flimsy wooden fence surrounded a dusty play yard where a dozen children scampered about, their voices rising and falling in a chaotic melody. To the bear, the noise was a beacon. Though it lacked the strength it once had, hunger lent its focus, driving it toward the source of the sound. The bear's massive frame loomed in the tree line as it approached, its eyes fixed on the children playing tag near the gate. It moved with a kind of dreadful inevitability, its footfalls barely audible over the din of the recess. None of the teachers noticed its presence until the bear pressed a heavy paw against the gate, splintering it with a single swipe. The crash sent birds scattering and froze every heart in the yard. Panic erupted like a summer storm. Children screamed and scattered in every direction, their small forms darting toward the doors and the teachers who tried desperately to corral them. The bear, driven by instinct and desperation, reared onto its hind legs and let out a guttural roar reverberating through the yard. With a sweep of its massive paw, it struck 3 toddlers who had frozen in place. Sasha, a quiet boy who loved to chase butterflies. Misha, always eager to climb the fence. And tiny Lena, who had just learned to run. Their young bodies crumpled to the ground before anyone could reach them. Blood flecked the dirt, a grotesque contrast to the once cheerful yard. Anna, one of the kindergarten teachers, acted on pure adrenaline. She grabbed the nearest thing she could, a wooden chair from the play yard, and rushed toward a group of children huddled against the far wall. The bear's head snapped toward her as it dropped to all fours, its focus now locked on the quivering cluster of children behind her. Anna planted herself between them and the predator, gripping the chair like a makeshift shield. The bear lunged, its jaws snapping inches from her face. Anna swung the chair with strength, the legs striking the bear's snout. It snarled in pain but didn't back down. Each second felt like an eternity as the bear swiped at the chair, splintering one of its legs. Anna stumbled but held her ground, motioning for the other teachers to get the children inside. Meanwhile, the commotion had drawn the attention of villagers. Armed with whatever they could find, shovels, firecrackers, even a rusted pitchfork, they rushed toward the kindergarten. The bear, sensing the growing threat, lashed out more violently. Anna managed to dodge a swipe that would have crushed her chest, but the force sent her sprawling onto the ground. The bear advanced, its maw inches from her. She thrust the broken chair upward, wedging it into its mouth just as it lunged. The first firecracker went off with a loud crack, momentarily stunning the bear. It jerked its head, dislodging the chair and growling furiously. A second firecracker followed, sending sparks flying and filling the air with acrid smoke. The bear hesitated, its instincts warring with its hunger. Villagers closed in, yelling and banging their makeshift weapons. A blow from a shovel struck its flank, followed by the sharp jab of the pitchfork. Each strike added to the cacophony of noise and pain that overwhelmed the beast. Finally, the bear turned and bolted, crashing through the fence and disappearing into the forest. The villagers chased it as far as the tree line, their shouts fading as they stood at the wilderness's boundary. Slowly, the group turned back toward the kindergarten, their faces pale and eyes wide. The aftermath was a scene of chaos and grief. The yard was eerily silent, save for the low murmurs of the teachers comforting children inside. The small forms of Sasha, Misha, and Lena lay motionless, carefully covered with blankets. Anna, trembling and bloodied, sat on the ground, clutching the remains of the chair. Villagers gathered around her, some placing reassuring hands on her shoulders, others staring blankly at the destruction. In the days that followed, the attack dominated every conversation in Baranovka. The regional authorities sent wildlife officials to investigate, but their resources needed to be improved. The bear was never found, though sightings of other grizzlies near the village increased frequently. The town petitioned for better protections, but bureaucracy moved slowly, and Baranovka remained vulnerable. Although she bore the title with little joy, Anna became a reluctant hero. She would often sit on the edge of the play yard, staring at the forest as if expecting the bear to return. Though young, the children bore the scars of that day in visible and unseen ways. The laughter returned to the kindergarten eventually, but it was quieter and less carefree. The fence was reinforced with iron bars, and a villager now stood watch during recess, rifle in hand. The morning air in a national park in Montana was crisp, carrying the mingling scents of pine, damp earth, and wildflowers. An experienced hiker, Emily Grayson, relished the solitude of her solo expeditions. Her lightweight pack held essentials, water, food, and a GPS beacon, but her route, a less traveled trail winding through a dense forest, demanded her full attention. She stepped carefully over roots and rocks, feeling the reassuring crunch of dirt beneath her boots. The trail climbed steadily, and by mid-morning Emily paused at a clearing to catch her breath. The view stretched far into the distance, the valley below blanketed in an endless canopy of green. She adjusted her hat, wiped the sweat from her brow, and continued onward, unaware of what awaited her further up the path. The terrain became more challenging as she climbed higher. The once clear path narrowed and disappeared into a dense thicket of shrubs and saplings. She hesitated momentarily but pressed forward, her instincts dulled by confidence. She hadn't seen another person for hours, and the quiet was broken only by the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves in the breeze. Emily didn't realize she had wandered into trouble until it was too late. A low, guttural sound froze her mid-step. She turned and saw the grizzly sow emerging from the brush, her two cubs just behind her. The bear's sheer size was staggering, an imposing wall of muscle and fur. Its ears were pinned back, its eyes locked on Emily. The distance between them was negligible, far too short for any chance of retreat. The sow charged. Emily's body moved before her mind caught up. She turned to run, but the bear closed the gap in seconds. A massive paw struck her shoulder, sending her sprawling down the slope. The world became a blur of tumbling earth, snapping branches and searing pain as she crashed to a stop against a boulder. Her leg twisted beneath her at an unnatural angle. The pain was immediate and paralyzing. She tried to sit up, but the bear was already upon her. Its weight crushed her chest as it pinned her to the ground. Teeth sank into her forearm, and her scream of pain reverberated through the forest. The bear shook its massive head, tearing into muscle and skin, before releasing her arm to swipe at her torso. Claws raked across her ribs, and Emily felt a sickening crack as the impact broke several bones. Blood soaked her shirt and dripped onto the mossy ground. The attack was relentless, each blow a calculated assertion of dominance and protection. Emily's vision blurred as she struggled to remain conscious. Her survival instincts screamed at her to stay still, to avoid provoking the sow further. The bear's snarls filled her ears, mixing with the metallic tang of blood in her mouth and the suffocating weight of its presence. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the bear retreated. The sow climbed back up the slope to her cubs, her roars diminishing as she ushered them deeper into the forest. Emily lay motionless, the sound of her ragged breathing the only indication that she was still alive. Pain engulfed her. Her left arm hung uselessly at her side, torn and mangled, while her chest heaved with shallow breaths. The broken leg was twisted unnaturally, sending waves of agony through her body with every slight movement. Emily fought to remain calm, knowing she had to act quickly to survive. The bear could return any moment, and nightfall would bring freezing temperatures. Gritting her teeth, she reached for her pack, which had been thrown several feet away during her fall. Each inch she dragged herself forward was a monumental effort, her bloodied body leaving streaks of red on the forest floor. Her good arm burned as she pulled herself over rocks and roots, the rough terrain punishing every movement. Finally, she grasped the edge of her pack and retrieved the GPS beacon. Activating the beacon was her lifeline, but it wouldn't bring help instantly. Emily knew she was hours away from rescue, maybe longer. She searched for a spot with some cover and found a shallow depression near the base of a tree. With her remaining strength, she dragged herself into it, trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. Time crawled. The pain in her chest and leg became an unbearable throb, a relentless rhythm that refused to let her rest. She pressed her uninjured hand to the wound on her arm, trying to staunch the bleeding with scraps of fabric torn from her shirt. Her mind drifted in and out of clarity, replaying the moment of the bear's charge repeatedly. The sound of its roar, the weight of its paw, the sharp crack of her bones, each detail etched itself into her memory with vivid precision. As the hours stretched endlessly, she became acutely aware of the forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds, the faint snap of a branch. Every noise sent a jolt of fear through her, a reminder that the bear, or another predator, could return at any moment. Emily focused on breathing, forcing herself to stay awake and alert, despite the overwhelming desire to succumb to exhaustion. Finally, as the light faded, she heard a helicopter's distant hum. Relief surged through her, mingling with the pain and exhaustion that had consumed her all day. The sound grew louder, and soon she saw the glint of sunlight reflecting off the aircraft as it hovered above the tree line. Moments later, the voices of the rescue team reached her ears, followed by the crunch of boots on the forest floor. They found her pale and bloodied, barely clinging to consciousness. The rescuers worked quickly, stabilizing her leg and applying pressure to her wounds before lifting her onto a stretcher. Emily felt the weight of her ordeal pressing down on her as they carried her to safety, her mind too cloudy to comprehend the full extent of her injuries. In the weeks that followed, Emily recovered physically, though scars and a limp would remain as permanent reminders of the attack. However, the emotional wounds were far deeper. The memory of the grizzly's crushing weight, its snapping jaws, and the raw power of its presence haunted her. She often woke in the night drenched in sweat, the echoes of the bear's growl reverberating in her dreams. Emily had always loved the wild, drawn to its beauty and solitude. But now she understood its unforgiving nature. The line between human confidence and nature's raw power was thinner than she had ever imagined. She would hike again someday, but never alone, and always with the knowledge that the wilderness was not a place to be tamed, but a force to be respected. The Thompson family's summer camping trip to Alaska was supposed to be an adventure of discovery and bonding. The Alaskan wilderness stretched endlessly around them, rugged and untamed, its pine-covered mountains and glacier-fed rivers promising a much-needed escape from suburban monotony. They pitched their tent at a remote campground on the edge of a dense forest, far from any town or cell service. It was idyllic. The air was crisp, the stars were dazzling, and the promise of adventure seemed to hum in every breeze. Full of youthful enthusiasm, 12-year-old Robbie Thompson spent the evening exploring the campsite with his younger sister Jessica. They poked at bugs, skipped rocks, and laughed until their stomachs hurt. Their parents, busy setting up the fire and unpacking supplies, warned them to stay close, but the children felt invincible, surrounded by the beauty of nature. As the family settled into their tent that night, they barely noticed the faint rustling beyond the tree line. A small mistake, leaving a bag of snacks inside the tent, set the stage for the most harrowing experience of their lives. The bear came in the quiet hours of the early morning, its presence signaled by the sound of claws tearing through nylon. Robbie was the first to wake, jolted upright by the sickening rip of fabric and the earthy stench of the animal. His eyes adjusted to the dim glow of the dying campfire outside, and there it was, a hulking black bear, its dark fur glinting faintly in the moonlight as it pawed at the scattered remnants of chips and candy. The tent sagged where it had torn, offering no barrier between the predator and its human occupants. Terror surged through Robbie. His heart hammered as he instinctively scrambled to his feet, his movements startling the bear. It shifted its attention from the snacks to the boy, a moving presence that triggered its instincts. With shocking speed, the bear lunged, its bulk crashing into the flimsy tent. Robbie bolted, propelled by sheer adrenaline, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he sprinted toward the woods. But he didn't get far. The bear overtook him in moments. Its massive paw struck him between the shoulder blades, throwing him to the ground like a rag doll. Pain exploded through his body as he landed hard, the bear looming over him. He barely had time to register its gaping maw before its teeth sank into his leg. The crushing pressure and searing pain made his screams tear through the hours of early morning like a warning siren. He clawed at the dirt, his desperate movements stirring up the scent of earth and pine, but the bear held fast, shaking him violently like prey. The campsite erupted in chaos. His parents awoke to the sound of his screams, their horror mounting as they realized what was happening. Robbie's father, John, grabbed their only weapon, a flare gun. He stumbled out of the tent, his hands shaking as he fumbled to load it. The crimson light of the first flare illuminated the scene. Robbie sprawled on the ground, his leg clamped in the bear's jaws, blood staining the dirt around him. John aimed and fired. The flare shot into the air with a sharp hiss, its bright light startling the bear. It hesitated, its head jerking toward the source of the noise. John fired again, this time closer to the ground. The flare burst near the bear's feet, a fiery explosion of sparks and smoke. The animal recoiled, releasing Robbie and retreating a few steps. Another flare followed, and the bear turned and bolted into the shadows, its massive form disappearing into the forest as quickly as it had appeared. Robbie lay motionless on the ground, his breaths coming in shallow, uneven gasps. Blood soaked his torn pajamas, pooling beneath his leg where the bear's teeth had torn through flesh and muscle. John dropped the flare gun and rushed to his son, his mind racing with panic and guilt. He tore strips from his shirt to create a makeshift tourniquet, his trembling hands working quickly to stem the bleeding. Jessica and her mother huddled near the remains of the tent, their faces pale and streaked with tears. The bear's scent lingered in the air, mingling with the acrid smoke of the spent flares. The forest felt suddenly oppressive, its shadows alive with imagined threats. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves sent shivers through the family, who knew the bear could return at any moment. Robbie was unconscious by the time help arrived hours later. A neighboring camper, alerted by the commotion, had driven to find cell service and called for rescue. Paramedics stabilized Robbie and rushed him to the nearest hospital, where he underwent hours of surgery to repair the shredded muscles and torn ligaments in his leg. The doctors marveled at his survival, calling it a miracle that the bear's powerful jaws hadn't severed an artery or crushed the bone entirely. The recovery was long and grueling. Robbie spent weeks in the hospital, enduring multiple surgeries and physical therapy sessions that tested his young body and spirit. The wounds eventually healed, but the scars remained, jagged reminders of the attack. Though his leg was spared amputation, it never fully recovered. A slight limp became part of his gait, a visible mark of that night in the Alaskan wilderness. For Robbie, the trauma wasn't just physical. Nightmares haunted him long after the attack, vivid memories of the bear's snarling face and the sensation of its teeth sinking into his leg replaying in his mind. Even the sound of rustling leaves could send him into a panic, his heart racing as if the bear were once again at his back. The Thompson family never returned to the wilderness. They sold their camping gear, and the torn and blood-stained tent was discarded without ceremony. They avoided stories about bears or camping trips, and their once carefree approach to the outdoors was replaced by caution and a lingering sense of vulnerability. The night was still, the silence that seemed to press against the ears, broken only by the occasional rustle of dry leaves in the wind. Hank Williams stood on the creaking porch of his ranch house, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Midnight had come and gone, yet sleep eluded him. Something had unsettled his herd earlier, a brief but urgent clamor of distressed moos that had echoed across the fields. Now there was silence again, but an uneasy one, as though the land was holding its breath. Hank had been ranching his whole life, carving out a livelihood in the rugged Montana wilderness. He knew the sounds of the night like the back of his calloused hand. Coyotes yipped from the hills, owls hooted from their perches, and the occasional distant rumble of a predator reminded him that nature was never far away. But the earlier disturbance nagged at him. Something wasn't right. He adjusted his grip on the rifle as he made his way toward the barn, a hulking silhouette against the moonlit sky. The air was cool and heavy, and there was a smell of hay and damp earth. A faint noise emerged as he neared, a low guttural growl that set every hair on his body on edge. The barn doors were ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. Hank froze, his instincts screaming caution, but years of living with the dangers of the wild country had also taught him not to hesitate. He pushed the door open further, stepping inside. The darkness was thick, illuminated only by a sliver of moonlight that filtered through the gaps in the wooden slats. His eyes quickly adjusted, and then he saw a massive grizzly bear, its shaggy brown fur gleaming faintly in the dim light. It was cornering one of his calves, the young animal trembling as it pressed into the far wall. The bear's sheer size was staggering, its shoulders rippling with muscle as it crouched low, teeth bared in a menacing snarl. Hank raised his rifle, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst, but the grizzly turned quickly and charged before he could steady his aim. In the confined space of the barn, the bear's advance was like a freight train barreling toward him. Hank barely managed to pull the trigger, the shot going wide, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The impact was immediate and brutal. The bear slammed into him with the force of a sledgehammer, sending him flying into a pile of tools stacked against the wall. Pain erupted in his back as he crashed into the metal and wood, the air forced from his lungs. His rifle skittered out of reach, useless now. Before he could scramble away, the bear was on him. Its claws raked across his shoulder, tearing through his jacket and into his flesh like hot knives. Hank screamed, the sound raw and primal, his vision blurring with the intensity of the pain. He swung his arms wildly, trying to shield himself, but the bear's jaws clamped down on his left arm. The pressure was unbelievable, bones grinding under the force as the bear shook its head, dragging him like a rag doll. Desperation surged through Hank, adrenaline overriding the agony. His free hand groped blindly, searching for anything he could use. His fingers closed around a pitchfork handle, half buried beneath the scattered tools. Summoning every ounce of strength, he drove the pitchfork into the bear's side. The bear roared so loud and guttural that it reverberated through the barn and into Hank's bones. The beast released his arm, momentarily stunned by the sharp pain. Hank didn't stop. He struck again, the prongs biting deeper into the bear's flank. It reared up on its hind legs, towering over him, swiping at the air in a fury. Hank used the momentary reprieve to crawl backward, his body screaming in protest with every movement. Blood poured from his shoulder and arm, pooling on the dirt floor beneath him. His vision swam, but he forced himself to stay conscious. The bear dropped back onto all fours, roaring again, but it seemed hesitant now, wary of the sharp weapon in his hand. It paced in agitated circles, growling and sniffing the air. Then, with a final earth-shaking roar, the grizzly turned and smashed through the barn's gate, splintering the wood as it disappeared into the darkness beyond. The sound of its heavy footfalls faded, leaving only the groaning of the injured calf and Hank's ragged breathing in the barn. Hank tried to stand, but collapsed immediately, his legs too weak to support him. The pain was overwhelming, radiating from his shredded shoulder and mangled arm. He knew he was in bad shape, but the stubborn will to survive kept him moving. Crawling inch by inch, he made his way out of the barn, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. The commotion had woken his neighbors, who lived a half-mile down the road. Flashlights bobbed in the distance as they approached. drawn by the gunshot and the bear's furious roars. Hank was barely conscious when they reached him, slumping against the barn door. They acted quickly, fashioning a makeshift tourniquet to stem the bleeding before loading him into a truck. The drive to the hospital was a blur, the pain coming in waves as he drifted in and out of awareness. He awoke briefly under the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room, doctors and nurses working frantically to stabilize him. His injuries were severe, a shattered arm, deep lacerations on his shoulder, and significant blood loss. But he was alive. Hank's story spread quickly through the local community and beyond in the following days. He was hailed as a hero for protecting his livestock, but he couldn't shake the deeper questions that gnawed at him during his recovery. The bear had been desperate, likely driven from its territory by human encroachment or dwindling food supplies. Hank had long been a firm believer in man's dominion over the land. But now, lying in a hospital bed with scars he would carry for the rest of his life, he began to wonder if that belief was misguided. The attack reignited debates in the region about wildlife management and the fragile balance between humans and the natural world. Some called for increased hunting quotas to reduce bear populations, while others argued for stricter conservation measures. For Hank, the issue wasn't so black and white. That night, he faced nature's raw, terrifying power, leaving him with a profound respect for the creatures he had once seen as adversaries. Hank returned to his ranch weeks later, his arm in a sling and his body weakened but still capable. The barn had been repaired, and the signs of the attack had been erased, but Hank always carried the memory. The air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and damp earth. A faint mist clung to the forest floor as Rachel and Leo pounded along the narrow trail, their breaths coming in quick bursts. The British Columbia Ultramarathon was a grueling challenge, 50 miles through rugged wilderness, steep inclines, and uneven terrain. For runners like Rachel and Leo, it was less a race and more a personal endurance test. The official route was marked by bright orange flags tied to trees every quarter mile. But fatigue muddied focus, and somewhere around mile 25 the trail forked unexpectedly. Rachel noticed the orange markers had disappeared, but Leo, just ahead, gestured toward a faint path that cut through the undergrowth. It wasn't marked, but it looked like a shortcut, a way to shave minutes off their time and edge closer to the leaders. They veered off without much thought, the thrill of the race propelling them forward. The shortcut at first seemed promising. The terrain was flatter and easier to navigate. The dense forest around them was quiet, save for the rhythmic thud of their footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But something felt wrong. The forest had grown oppressively still, the kind of silence that warned of unseen predators. Rachel's instincts prickled, but Leo was already several strides ahead, his focus unwavering. She dismissed the unease as race nerves and pushed on. About 15 minutes in, the trail narrowed into a corridor of thick trees. The ground became softer, the moss spongy beneath their shoes. They passed fresh claw marks gouged into a tree trunk and a pile of scat on the trail, its pungent odor unmistakable. Rachel's stomach tightened. This wasn't just a wildlife trail, it was bear territory. Before she could call out to Leo, the undergrowth ahead exploded with movement. A young grizzly bear, large enough to be dangerous, but small enough to be reckless, emerged onto the trail, its fur bristling and eyes wide with alarm. Startled, it froze for a split second before charging directly at Leo. Leo barely had time to react. The bear barreled into him, knocking him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, and the bear was on him instantly. Its massive claws raked across his back, tearing through his lightweight running gear and into flesh. Leo thrashed wildly, trying to shield his head and neck with his arms. Blood spattered the ground bright against the mossy trail. Rachel stood frozen, her legs rooted like the earth had seized her. The scene was a nightmare come to life. Leo's screams, the guttural growls of the bear, and the sickening sound of claws ripping into flesh. Her mind screamed at her to move, to do something, but her body refused. The bear turned its head toward her, its eyes locking onto the source of her screams. Rachel's breath hitched, and the world seemed to tilt momentarily. The bear lumbered off Leo's crumpled form and took a few menacing steps in her direction. Its growls deepened, resonating through her chest like distant thunder. Leo groaned behind it, the sound weak and pitiful. The bear hesitated, swiveling its head back toward him. In a flash of clarity, Rachel realized the distraction might be her only chance. Her legs finally obeyed. She spun on her heel and sprinted down the trail, her shoes barely gripping the soft earth. Branches whipped her arms and face as she crashed through the forest, every instinct urging her forward. Behind her, the bear's grunts mingled with Leo's fading cries, a cacophony that would haunt her forever. Rachel didn't stop, didn't dare glance back. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs wobbled beneath her. She stumbled onto a wider trail, one marked with the bright orange flags that had been absent for so long. Relief and guilt collided as she realized she'd found her way back to the main route. Hours later, after navigating the trail with trembling hands and tear-streaked cheeks, she came across a search team stationed at an aid station. Collapsing into their arms, she tried to explain what had happened. The team mobilized immediately, grabbing first aid supplies and weapons before heading in the direction she had described. When they found Leo, it was too late. He was alive, but barely, his body broken and bloodied. The bear had wandered off after the initial attack, leaving Leo to cling to life amidst the carnage. The rescue team carried him out, their faces grim as they assessed the extent of his injuries. At the nearest hospital, doctors fought to save him. Hours of surgery followed, but the damage was too severe. Leo succumbed on the operating table, his body unable to endure the trauma. Rachel was consumed by guilt and unanswered questions. Could she have done more? Should she have risked her life to save him? The rational part of her knew she had no choice, but the guilt remained. The ultramarathon organizers suspended the race and launched an investigation. An unmarked shortcut had led runners into a known bear habitat, a critical oversight that sparked outrage and demands for stricter safety measures. Wildlife officials stressed the importance of staying on marked trails and understanding the risks of wilderness areas. Rachel withdrew from the running community, haunted by the memory of the bear's charge, Leo's screams, and the blood on the forest floor. She avoided others, unable to face questions or the silent judgment of those who couldn't understand the terror of that moment. Meanwhile, nature carried on. The bear returned to its territory, unaware of the tragedy it had caused. Rain washed away the signs and the forest grew anew, erasing all visible traces of the attack. But Rachel's scars remained. They were unseen, yet a constant reminder of humanity's fragility against the raw power of the wild. The Carpathian Mountains stretched out endlessly, their snow-draped peaks glinting under a pale winter sun. Ivan had been hunting in these forests since he was a boy, his instincts honed by years of tracking deer and wild boar. But this time was different. The cold was biting, and food was scarce. His traps had become empty for days, and desperation had pushed him farther into the wilderness than ever before. The bear's tracks had been fresh, pressed deep into the snow. They were enormous, the unmistakable imprints of a fully grown Carpathian brown bear. Ivan knew the risk. Such animals were best avoided unless necessary, but hunger outweighed caution. He had followed the trail for hours, weaving through dense trees and icy ravines. The wind carried faint scents of musk and fur, growing stronger as he pressed on. When he finally spotted the bear, it was a towering mass of muscle and fur, rooting through a frozen carcass half buried in the snow. Its breath steamed in the cold air, and its shaggy coat rippled with every movement. Ivan steadied his rifle, his hands trembling, not from fear but from the cold that seemed to seep into his bones. He aimed the broad expanse of its shoulder, hoping for a clean kill. The shot cracked through the forest like a whip, sending birds scattering from the treetops. The bear roared a deep guttural sound that echoed in Ivan's chest. The bullet had struck, but not fatally. Blood matted its fur, a dark stain against the white snow, but instead of fleeing, the bear turned. Its eyes locked onto Ivan with a ferocity that froze him in place. The bear charged. It moved faster than Ivan had anticipated, its powerful limbs churning through the snow. He barely had time to chamber another round before the beast was upon him. With a single swipe, it knocked the rifle from his hands, spinning it into a snowdrift. The impact of the blow sent Ivan sprawling onto his back, the air forced from his lungs. Before he could scramble, the bear's jaws clamped down on his leg. Pain shot through him like a bolt of lightning as its teeth sank into his flesh, and he felt himself being dragged through the snow. The world blurred around him, trees, sky, snow, spinning as the bear shook him violently. Desperation overtook him, and his hand fumbled for the hunting knife strapped to his belt. With a wild swing, Ivan drove the blade into the bear's neck. The creature bellowed in pain, releasing his leg and staggering backward. Blood sprayed from the wound, painting the snow in crimson streaks. Ivan scrambled away, his leg throbbing and useless beneath him. He tried to stand but collapsed immediately, his injured limb unable to support his weight. The bear didn't retreat. Instead, it circled him, roaring and snapping its jaws, feinting lunges that sent Ivan backward. Each roar was a visceral reminder of the animal's power, a sound that seemed to shake the earth beneath him. Ivan's hands were numb, his vision swimming from blood loss and exhaustion. His rifle was out of reach, and the knife lay in the churned snow. Panic and instinct propelled him toward the nearest tree, a massive pine whose trunk rose straight and strong. Ivan clawed his way up, his hands slipping on the icy bark. The bear charged, ramming its body against the tree and shaking it violently. Ivan clung to the branches, his breath ragged as the beast rose onto its hind legs, its claws raking deep gouges into the bark. The bear's roars filled the air as it battered the tree, snapping lower branches and swiping at Ivan's dangling boots. He climbed higher, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through his leg. Blood dripped steadily into the snow below, drawing the bear's attention like a predator drawn to wounded prey. It circled again, pacing restlessly, its eyes never leaving him. Hours passed. The sun sank behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the forest. Ivan's grip weakened, his body racked with shivers as the temperature plummeted. The bear lingered, pawing at the ground and occasionally rearing to claw at the tree. Ivan's heart pounded anew each time it roared, fear keeping him awake and alert despite his exhaustion. Finally, as darkness fell, the bear seemed to lose interest. It let out one final roar, which seemed to echo with frustration and fury, before lumbering into the forest. Ivan waited, his body frozen, unwilling to trust it was gone. The minutes stretched into hours, and still he didn't move. The forest was silent when dawn broke, except for the occasional creak of snow-laden branches. Ivan cautiously descended the tree, his muscles stiff and uncooperative. The ground was a grim tableau. Blood-streaked snow, deep claw marks, and broken branches scattered like debris from a storm. His leg throbbed with every step as he limped toward where his rifle had fallen. He retrieved it with trembling hands, though it now felt more like a relic than a weapon. The journey back to his village was grueling. Every step was a test of willpower, his injured leg dragging behind him as he left a trail of blood in the snow. The memory of the bear's enraged eyes burned in his mind, a haunting image that seemed to follow him through the trees. He felt not just fear, but a deep, humbling respect for the creature that had nearly ended his life. When Ivan finally reached the edge of the village, his strength gave out, and he collapsed into the snow. Villagers found him and carried him inside, their hushed voices filled with equal parts relief and horror as they tended to his wounds. The story of his encounter spread quickly, turning into a cautionary tale about the power and unpredictability of nature. In the following weeks, Ivan recovered physically, but his spirit was forever changed. Once a place of familiarity and opportunity, the forest seemed vast and indifferent, its dangers far greater than he had ever realized. The bear had taught him a brutal lesson. Nature was not something to be conquered but respected, its balance fragile, and its inhabitants ferociously protective of their place. Though he eventually returned to the forest, Ivan never again hunted as recklessly as he had that day.